Thank you very much. Good afternoon to, or good morning to, or good evening to all our participants. I'm Marcello Scalisi, the Director of UNIMED, Mediterranean University Union. I'm very pleased to do this opening of the Global Task Force on Third Country Education Pathways. The Global Task Force promotes and supports the expansion of higher education as a complementary pathway for refugee students. An increasing number of refugees in higher education is one of the main goals of the UNHCR, but all of us. The issue is 15 by 30 to achieve the refugees in higher education by 15% by 2030. A strategy for refugee inclusion, but also the idea to meet the ambitious goal of the 3-year strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways. The main activities of the Global Task Force are convening relevant stakeholders to advocate for an increase in complementary education pathways programs globally. And as UNIMED, we are focused on the Mediterranean region, but this is a global dimension, extremely important also to underline. Coordinating, again, a global community of practice on third country education pathways to share best practices and lessons learned and facilitate collaboration in setting up complementary education pathways, supporting the development of pilot programs and sustainable funding models, which is another very important issue. Developing tools and resources in collaboration with members of the Global Task Force and the community of practice to support the design, implementation, and expansion of further education as a complementary pathways for refugees, promoting minimum standards for the design of complementary education pathways, and providing assistance and capacity building to ensure new and existing programs meet these standards. And the GTF members include representatives of states, regional and international bodies, the private sector, NGOs, refugee representatives, UN agencies and donors who are engaged in supporting complementary education pathways and are committed to expanding further education opportunities as a durable solution for refugee students. The Global Task Force members are l'Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie, European Commission, GO, European University Association, Government of Germany, represented by the DAD, Government of Canada, Government of Portugal, Abeisha Project, Institute of International Education, Japan ICU Foundation, Open Society Foundation, Open Society University Network, Pathways Japan, UNESCO, UNHCR, UNIMED, World Education Services, and World University Services of Canada. Just before to conclude, two words about the reason why a network as UNIMED is part of the Global Task Force. So in the past, we did a very interesting project on how to support inclusion of refugees in our education system in the European university environment, but also in the Southern Mediterranean, working in particular to support Syrian refugees. We did a very interesting project financed by the European Commission on the Middle East, in particular Middle East universities in Jordan, Kurdistan, in Lebanon, called Rescue. But we did the same experiences also in the European side, how to include refugees in European university, and that project was called INEA. We are continuous to work on this double dimension, the European dimension, the Southern dimension, and thinking that university in crisis situation have to play an important role in not only in supporting refugees, but also to identify solutions. The last point that I would like to underline is why training. The main idea is to show the necessity of a shared approach and avoid, if possible, at least to minimize fragmentation from the point of view of methodology and terminology, and creating new synergies and provide a common framework. And when I say a common framework, about all the stakeholders involved, and not only about higher education system, but also funding institution and government. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much for joining us for this first training session, and I leave the floor to Neve.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. For some, Marcelo's voice may have been a little low. You can see in the chat, I put our just newly launched, freshly launched website, which is www.pathways.org. So that's the Global Task Force website. And Marcelo talked about the mission and the objectives of the task force and our current membership. So all of that you can also find on this website, and you can learn more about the work that we do and our members and ways to get involved. I don't want to take too much time, but I also just wanted to welcome everyone to really this first series of our 6-part series, which will take place between October 5 and December 14th. We do have different topics that we would like to cover over the next two and a half months, I guess. You will hear the word complementary education pathways a lot, and we certainly recognize that not everyone may be familiar with that term. So that is really the reason why we're here today, to clarify that terminology, to ensure that everyone knows what we, and by we I mean the task force, this global community, mean by complementary education pathways. Next week at the same time, we will meet to launch our global community of practice. And that is really an opportunity for everyone who is here today, for those who may not be able to join today, but next week, to come together and really discuss what they as institutions, organizations, states need in order to take the next step in either expanding or developing their own pathway programs. On November 2nd, we were going to dive a little more into actual sort of programmatic and design barriers and challenges. We're going to discuss everything from application to the university admission process, provide good practices, feedback, and lessons learned to all of our attendees. That will be followed by a session on creating durable solutions for refugee students, meaning solutions that will allow students to remain in their country of study after they complete their degrees. On November 30th, so I'm walking you through sort of the next 2.5 months, we will talk about setting students up for success. And what we mean by that is really what is needed to ensure or to do our best that students, once they are on campus, can succeed both academically, but also on a more personal level. So of course, this will include things like academic counseling, but also any other support services that students may need when they study on your campuses. And then last but not least, on December 14th, right before Christmas, we will have the session on the million-dollar question of creating sustainable programs. And again, that really relates to creating programs that it will highlight different funding models for programs and also discuss ideas and ways that can be explored to ensure that programs rely less on external funding sources, which, as we all know, sort of come and go and dry out. So we will discuss a few of those models that are out there to develop and fund pathway programs. With that, I would like to give it over to my colleague, Anna, who's really gonna sort of take the first step in explaining complementary education pathways and kick off the session. Anna, over to you.
Okay, brilliant. So then I should ideally be able to. Okay. Can everybody see this? Okay, amazing. Thanks so much. Apologies, technical hiccups always happen as you venture into new software and new platforms. So let me introduce myself for those who haven't met me. My name is Anna Gert Davis, and I work within UNHCR's Division of International Protection, leading on the portfolio of complementary pathways, which includes education pathways, but also covers labor mobility and family reunification, as well as policy questions that relate to pathways in general terms, and internal infrastructure at UNHCR side to ensure that we deliver as far as our organizational commitment goes. So for the purposes of this presentation, as Nelly had mentioned, I will speak a little bit as to the general framework and definitional components, what we mean by pathways, and then zoom in to what we mean by education pathways, and look into the components as to why we thought this series would make sense and what it is we would like to cover by this series. So without further ado, when we mean by complementary pathways, it's such a big term, many people are thrown off by it. In many ways, it's very much an umbrella term, which many may or may not understand. The official definition that exists of the term is before you. To read it quickly, it's a safe, what by complementary pathway we mean it's a safe and regulated avenue for refugees that complement resettlement by providing lawful stay in a third country where their international protection needs are met. A lot of different things are thrown into this definition. It's very dense, but I will quickly go through some of the highlighted components here. So safe and regulated avenues essentially means a person is crossing an international border using a regulated legal way of doing so. For refugees, meaning a person has international protection needs, has been either officially recognized or has applied for asylum, or in some circumstances fall within the wider protection category where asylum systems are not available as such, but definitely has international protection needs. Now, following that complement resettlement, and I will focus on this one for a second later in the presentation. But here, traditionally, we look at third country solutions and we highlight resettlement as being the main modality. Resettlement is based on very clear-cut identification criteria that are rooted in the protection needs of the individual refugees, individual persons in need of international protection, and have nothing to do with their qualifications, their skills, their languages. It's really that imminent need to move a person from their current situation because of an imminent protection risk that exists for that person wherever they are. That is quite important in understanding when we look at pathways, because pathways is anything but resettlement. Resettlement is managed by quota systems. It's very much at the discretion of the states. And like I said, it's something that's rooted in that protection component, protection need of the individual who will eventually benefit from it. Resettlement is also an incredibly limited by scope and availability tool that is really accessible by very few. And resettlement process as such is managed through UNHCR identification and submission against country quotas, as opposed to also complementary pathways, which really rely on very different identification methodology. Now, moving on here, we're looking at the component of lawful stay. So person enters, that person is a refugee. He or she enters because of something different than protection need into another country where he or she needs to be legally stayed for a certain duration of time. If we narrow it down to education, with education, that means a student visa, some kind of other permit or entry visa that could be humanitarian, for example, that allows initial entry and then allows subsequent legal stay in that country. In the third country, I think that's quite clear. So complementarity of the pathways in the realm of solutions, we're really looking at the third country solutions bit. And then one last very important component of this is international protection needs are met. So international protection needs are met means that person is protected from refoulement, has access to rights and services as others would, and then ideally, coming back to this component of lawful stay, can benefit from a long-term solution provided through this initial entry and a study course, a work of as such. As I said, the definition is very dense, and I know it's a lot to take in, but in simple terms, what we're really looking at is to look at migratory pathways that exist. So you have student visas, you have labor permits and such, that foreigners normally use to enter another country for that purpose. What we're trying to do here is to broaden the qualifications and ensure that those passages and those programs take into account the particularities of refugee population, allow refugees to compete for the opportunities at the same level as anybody else who would do so, while also protecting them from refoulement and allowing them to find a solution through these components. So it's slightly adjusted legal regime that really looks into the specifics of the nature of what it takes to be a refugee, and we'll go through those details in a bit more detail, through those components in a bit more detail later, and how they can really compete for the opportunities while attaining solutions. When we speak of pathways as they're very specific to persons in need of international protection, we also must ensure that there's the backbone of the right to asylum and protection against refoulement. So anybody coming into these programs should have an opportunity to seek asylum if no other solution is envisaged or possible. Protection against refoulement, I already mentioned. No person can be, legally speaking, sent back to their country of origin where they could face imminent harm. Components such as legal status and documentation. I've mentioned already it's legal status, legal entry, legal stay for the duration of the course, but also the subsequent stay arrangements and ensuring that the person has the right to remain within the country legally and likely remain in that country through well, either a migration type setup or application for asylum. I have to say, in our experience, those applications are quite random and very few. So mainly for education, for example, you would have somebody finishing a course and then having some period of time legally staying in the country to find employment and then getting permanent residency based on that employment and then eventually qualifying for citizenship, so to speak. Documentation is a key component here. We have to realize that refugees, by nature of who they are, oftentimes lack identity documents. They have no access or possibility to request these documents of their countries of origin for fear of persecution. They may not necessarily have the right credential documents, particularly if they fled their countries of origin recently and haven't been able to take them with them. So all of those components must be addressed within the program design piece when we look at pathways. The others that you see before you are, of course, equally important. However, they often have something to do with state systems, perhaps less so with higher education institutions. But I mentioned access to rights and services, respect to family unity are very much key components of the design. When we speak about prevention of statelessness, that is very much linked to the need for documentation and ensuring the persons who come in have a valid, recent, and documents that would remain valid through the duration of the stay, or an alternative needs to be worked out. I'll give you an example. Many, for example, would come on convention travel documents. Initially, convention travel documents expire within a year or two, depending on who had issued it. And that is something that the program design needs to ensure that there is an alternative, whereby the country where they are issues something else, or there is some kind of arrangement put in place to ensure that that convention travel document is either extended, but better off replaced with a bit more of a permanent document in the country of stay. Of course, data protection components are very important and remain very important when sharing information on individual students and confidentiality considerations and freedom from discrimination and exploitation. Another one I will spend a second on is the right to family unity. When we speak of students, especially younger students, that's often not within the program design of some of the programs. However, it is key to understand that students thrive much better when they do have their families next to them. There's ample data to confirm integration potential and how much better individuals who have traveled with their families rather than staying alone and worrying for them staying in some other country. And of course, family unity remains a fundamental human right, which we all should strive to attain. I already mentioned that pathways are very different from resettlement. So when we look at resettlement, we identify a person based on the protection need. When we look at pathways, we look at their language skills, education background, professional qualifications, experience, not the protection needs as such. We're still considered the complementary pathways as opposed to legal pathways still focus on the beneficiary that is a person in need of international protection. However, the identification for the beneficiary here is more agency-based, it's more qualifications-based rather than protection needs. And I should also re-emphasize here that when we speak of resettlement, agency of a refugee in the resettlement process is not a factor, meaning a refugee cannot apply for resettlement. It's very much determined for them based on their particular protection-related needs. Whereas for complementary pathways, it's really opportunities where different stakeholders and refugees themselves have the lead in identifying and moving people based on qualifications that exist. The realm of pathways is very broad. So we are focusing here today and in the series on education, but we also have humanitarian visas, humanitarian admission programs, community sponsorship, rather it's private sponsorship or naming pathways. I mentioned family reunification already and employment. Out of these, they kind of form categories on their own. I won't spend too much time on that qualification today, but education and employment are the two that are closely linked because they are rooted in the previous qualification of an individual, including education qualifications, work-related qualifications, skills that they've had, and language skills oftentimes have a very key role to play in that. Now, a few words on the legal or rather commitment regimes that exist out there. It's been already mentioned the 3-year strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways. Well, it's a 3-year strategy with a 10-year goal, and I think we're looking into renaming that strategy into something else because the 3 years are about to expire. It's 19 to 21. So the goals of it is 1 million resettlement departures, 2 million complementary pathways beneficiaries, benefiting 3 million in total. For the sake of education, it's also important to understand that the goals of education pathways lie very closely with the goals of the education strategy 15 by 30, as we call it, whereby 15% of refugees, of persons in need of international protection within a certain age range should be enrolled in college or different types of trainings by 2030. So the two goals kind of coordinate very well together when it comes to providing opportunities, but also solutions through these pathways going forward. This is in a nutshell what the goals look like for 2021, we're supposed to achieve 160 persons achieving solutions through complementary pathways. This is not specific to education, so all of them together. And you kind of see the range how it follows. And I will quickly go through the data that we have on education right now a bit later on. So for education pathways specifically, safe and regulated avenues for refugees in another country for the purpose of education, with a link to legal stay that is available post-graduation. Very specific to education, very specific to students' aspirations. I'm sorry, I think the screen disappeared. Can you still see it? Sorry.
No, excuse me. No, yeah, it disappeared, as you said. Yet now now it disappeared again.
I'm sorry. Well, if it doesn't cooperate, then we'll do it without PowerPoint.
Okay.
An important component here is to also stress that pathways are not UNHCR and state run. There's a myriad of different partners that come into play, of course, including UNHCR states, but also all of you, higher education institutions, universities, university networks, on both host country and the receiving side, that play a huge role in ensuring that these programs take off and are available to beneficiaries out there. Like I mentioned, these are some numbers of what we know about education pathways, and this is based on the UNHCR OECD study of first-time entry permits given to nationals of 7 biggest refugee-producing countries. You will see them before you, so it's Iran, Venezuela, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Eritrea, Somalia, given by OECD plus Brazil countries in the scope of 2010 to 2019. So for the time being, we have over 135,000 individuals who have benefit from education on their own, likely with some exceptions, but this is the data that's provided by the state statistical agencies that essentially collate and look at permits exclusively. There are a lot of unanswered questions in this data, but it's a good indication of what is going on in this space already. That is not to say that it's a done deal, we have nothing to do here. There's certainly room to look into what is not working in these systems and how we could generally improve refugees accessing these. And I'm fortunate enough to have Neil Deng with me, who is one of the beneficiaries of such programs, who will then later speak to some of the difficulties refugees face in accessing these at his own experience, and hopefully we'll be able to give some advice and insight as to how we could jointly work to change those. So that said, before you see the, well, as we call it, the journey. So a refugee student wants to apply for an opportunity, and there's certainly a number of different issues that he or she faces that are divided before you in 4 blocks. So you're looking at the country of asylum, the process of admissions, then the actual process of immigration, and then after arriving in the country, post-arrival. In the first asylum, there's often what's cited as lack of opportunities, lack of documentation, lack of language courses and language credentials. As such, once an individual is lucky enough to find an opportunity, the understanding of the intricacies of the academic admissions process is certainly something that is quite complicated, but also financial restrictions and limitations that refugees face, both at the level of applications, but actual financing of the studies themselves at the stage of application for the visa. And typically these rely on student type visas, where there's requirements to show that you non-immigrant intent, so to speak, that you're not intending to stay in this new country. Again, documentary requirements, identification documents, financial requirements that cannot really be necessarily met by somebody in a refugee situation. And then upon arrival, there's of course a need for support, psychosocial assistance, or often having to deal with hostile communities that may or may not be familiar with the foreigner amongst them, quote unquote, let alone a foreigner who has likely experienced quite a challenging past going in their lives. And limited access to local economic opportunities, and this has a lot to do with that next step component as to certainty of the future and what do I do after that study period is over? What would be the linkage into the workforce of the country, and hence and as more sustainable solution for me as well as my family going forward. I will leave it at this. As many of you probably know, we have addressing the need for more sustainable source of education opportunities that have been verified. We internally at UNHCR have put together a portal of opportunities platform, as we call it, where different in-country and third-country opportunities are gathered in one space, and we would very much encourage all of you, once developing additional opportunities for refugees, either in country or going to another country, to reach out to us so that we could also advertise them on the portal and have refugees learn of these in a more sustained and sustainable fashion. Thanks so much. I will leave it at that and give the floor to Neil now, if you don't mind, to share a bit of, sorry, now this is not letting me. So to share his experience of going through pathways and perhaps speak a bit more personally of some of the challenges that have been mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna. Niall, I know that you're there, so I think once we can unshare the screen, the floor is all yours. Please, Niall, I see you. Go ahead.
Great,
Yes.
thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Niall Deng. I'm South Sudanese refugee student, and I'm currently in Canada. I'm attending Huron University, and my family has been affected by war and conflict intergenerational. I spent 11 years in Kakuma refugee camp, which is one of the largest refugee camps in the world. And while I was a refugee in Kakuma, I always have a dream. I wanted, to be able to travel and explore the world. I want to go to university and become a journalist and be able to tell the stories of my community. And I didn't have access to those opportunities. As all of us know, we all have dreams and we all have, aspiration that we want to pursue. But refugee students like myself and refugee youth across the world, have access to opportunities that could turn those dreams into realities. And this is something that is very dehumanizing. When you're in a situation where you don't have access to opportunities that could enable you to grow, that could enable you to have a better future, that dehumanize you. And there was a situation in Kakuma that nothing will be able to comport me. And I'm lucky that I'm one of the very few, as we have seen, in the presentation shared by Hannah. They just, I think, 5% of young refugees now who have access to, to higher education opportunities, and this is something that is very disturbing, because majority of the world population are young people who are the future leaders of their country, who could rebuild their countries and who could contribute to our world in so many ways. And I'll just go briefly, into some of the barriers I faced while, applying to education opportunities and being able to come to Canada. One of the main barriers I faced was access to information. As we know, most of the young refugees live in refugee camps or urban setting where they don't have enough access to electricity, they don't have enough access to the internet. This makes it so hard to access information application. This makes it so hard to access, let's say, a college counseling program that could enable them, to know how the whole process works. For example, myself, I always wanted to go to the US and then, apply to the University of Berkeley by myself in the refugee camp with no one helping me. I was able to get in, but what I didn't know is that Berkeley was a state-funded school and they didn't have, a scholarship for international students. And I was not able to get a scholarship, which doesn't work for me. I saw my estimated cost of our standard was 67,000 US dollars, and my funding offer to me was zero. I was like, how is this going to work for me? One of the other barriers is access to funding and banking. Most applications, will need you to pay application fees, which most young refugees will not be able to do because they don't have access to, let's say, a credit card, or they don't even have access to funding to be able to pay that. You'll be required to to do tests, English proficiency tests. You don't have the funding for those. Sometimes you'll have to travel to be able to do those. For example, in my context in Kakuma, the nearest testing center was 800 kilometers away in Nairobi. So I'll have to take, a long bus ride, go through a crazy process to get a movement pass to go to Nairobi and do that. And I think one thing that could be done is to waive this, to be able to waive these application fees so that young refugees should be able to apply without that barrier. The other challenge is, issues with travel. Refugees, as Anna said, don't often have, travel document. They cannot go back to their country to get this travel document. And that makes it so hard for them to travel internationally. For example, in my case, I had to apply for a conventional travel document, which is the document I'm using now. It's a very crazy process to be able to get that document. And even, to travel internationally, there are many challenges that you face on the way. I came across so many migration officers who don't even know my document. I have to stay in the line for so long for them, to consult other colleagues so that they be able to free me. And I think, that could be a barrier, that people could look into, for example, by exploring ways to, let's say, partner with organizations like IAM, that I've seen, that does a lot of great work in helping refugees travel international and be able, to engage immigration officers so that they're able to fast freely, and funding as well. Being able to get money for a flight ticket is a huge challenge. So looking into ways that refugees could travel, be able to go to third country and access education without that barrier is also something that would be very helpful. And the other barrier is adjusting to the new environment. You come to a country where, for example, you might not even speak the language. You don't know the culture, and you have to adjust, to a new environment. So that is a challenge, and exploring opportunities for, for, let's say, collaboration with local organizations that could support refugees in those, communities. Having college counseling program, in university where young refugees are, because something that is very important is not just, being able to access education, but being able to be in an environment where you're able to thrive and succeed. Because you could have access to education, but you're not able to thrive and succeed because you don't know how the whole thing works. For example, during my first week at Euron, I had challenges, with getting to know the platform that we use here, to be able to submit assignment or be able, to connect with professors. And I was able to get support, to be able to do that. And lastly, uh, uh, lastly is, I think, we all know what education means to young refugees. I think looking at our current context, majority of refugees live in communities, that have their own challenges. Most of the country hosting refugees have the own challenges that they struggle with. And that makes it for refugees to access durable solution in those places. So higher education opportunities and complementary pathway education opportunities is one great way for young refugees to be able to access education. It's a great way to recognize refugee skill, for example, through mobility programs, and help refugees contribute to the world and the new communities with these skill and experiences. Not just have those experiences in skill west in refugee camp or urban setting where they don't have opportunities to grow and thrive. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Ananal. And we know it's so many issues, so many topics to cover in such a limited time. We're running a little behind schedule. We're going to break out into 2 panel discussions, breakout groups right now. Come back, everyone. I hope you all had good breakout sessions. I see Rebecca. Rebecca, over to you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I was in the North America breakout room, and it was incredibly informative. So I hope that was the experience in the Europe room as well. So we have just 2 minutes left. So I want to invite Alvaro and Anik to report out on just one finding that came out of the conversations in the breakout rooms. So maybe we can hear from Alvaro first, and then we'll turn to Anik, and then we'll wrap things up.
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. Well, as mentioned, we had a lot of information, a lot of perspectives, but I'll wrap it up on only one point. And I think it was, there's different perspectives from public, private institutions and different countries which implement these kind of programs. But at the end, we can say, or I can conclude that perspectives that we heard, there's always an interest in the benefits international or refugee students can bring to their campuses, to their communities, with their students, to their countries. And I think that's something very important that the higher education institutions have to take into considerations when they are starting to speak about these kind of programs now, of all the benefits they can bring to their communities, not only of the benefits they will bring to the classrooms, but as a whole in all the sectors, in a professional sector, in a student sector, in a leadership sector, and how it's not only a win for the higher education institutions, but it's a benefit for both parts, for the student and the higher education institutions. And I mean, I would like to have more time to describe everything we discussed there, but as a main point, we could say that all the higher education institutions that participated in this panel had identified big benefits for the whole community that receives or hosts refugee students of their communities. And I could say it was one of the main points discussed in the North America panel.
Thank you, Alvaro. And Anik, perhaps we can hear one point from you as well from the room that was talking about Europe. Anik, can you hear us? I cannot see you on the screen.
Okay.
Yes,
So
better. Now we can hear you. Thank you.
we had testimony from 3 countries in various stages for complementary pathways. Italy, very advanced. Spain, in good shape, with Barcelona, and France just beginning. So it was very fruitful to compare. And if I want to keep one word from this testimony, it will be teamwork. Okay, what impressed me the most is how much making these complementary pathways working. I like very much the concept of university corridors. Okay, it's that it is a real, you have many, it's a chain of goodwill. Okay, from UNHCR in the first country or second country, in the host country, to the UNHCR in the third country, and the university, of course, at the center. And so many people are involved in all the details that it's wonderful how well it can work. And well, the testimony of the Mehari Johannes, who is the refugee from our session, it was very touching how grateful he is of all the teamwork done for these corridors. Thank you.
Thank you, Anik and Alvaro, for those quick report outs. So we've already reached the time, and I see that Neela wrote in the chat that we're going to be sharing the recording and the PowerPoint on complementary pathways after this meeting. And we really hope that many of you will be joining us for the future sessions. The next one is on Tuesday, October 12th, the launch of the Global Community of Practice, followed by November 2nd, where we're going to be talking about the application to university admission process. So thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in about a week's time.
Thank you. It was very useful. Have a nice evening.
Bye.